Throughout history, there were many brutal revolutions that ushered in periods of mass execution and violence. Inside of France, the French Revolution led to the executions of thousands of people, including the King and Queen, on an execution device brought in by the very man who lost his head on it. The guillotine became known as the nation's razor for the fact it was used on a daily basis against those who were considered anti-revolutionary. Following the execution of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette the Queen, there was a period known as the Terror, and everyday civilians and members of the population were being dragged to the execution scaffold, where the slanted blade then fell upon their necks. Even the very man who led the Terror, Maximilian Robespierre, would fall from grace and lose his head on the guillotine. But there were even a collection of nuns who became victims of the device, and no one was safe. After these deaths, thousands of people were interred inside of different cemeteries, which became very full, and many of those people's remains were later laid to rest inside of the Paris catacombs, which can be seen today. In this documentary, we look at the different executions of the brutal French Revolution. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
King Louis ascended onto the throne in 1774 when he was 19 years old, and he inherited a country already in turmoil. At the time, the government was grossly in debt, and there was a growing resentment in France of the monarchy. He doubted his ability to deal with issues, and he did wish to be liked by the population, saying, "It may be considered politically unwise, but it seems to me to be a general wish, and I want to be loved." He was determined to do his best and to be a good king, and he wished to consult the public on a number of affairs, but his reign was plagued with poor decisions, scandal and economic suffering. Louis did accept attempts by his ministers to relieve the economic issues in France, but one of the biggest issues was that Louis was in support of the colonists in the American War of Independence, and by providing financial support to them, it plunged France to the verge of bankruptcy. He himself was seen as a big spender in the country, and at the time his population were beginning to suffer greatly. There was a crisis with people not being able to afford food and to pay for it, leading to people starving. In a last-ditch attempt to solve the financial problems, Louis assembled the Estates General, the National Assembly that represented the three estates or classes of the French people, the nobility, the clergy and the commoners. This had not been gathered for over 170 years, but the commoners used it to declare itself the National Assembly, and beginning the spark of the French Revolution. To the French people, Louis and his Queen Marie Antoinette were seen as lavish spenders, and Marie also began to become a figure of hatred, as she was known for spending huge sums of the country's money on decorations, furniture, clothes, and extravagant things for herself. Whilst the people were suffering, Marie and Louis were having banquets, and this was seen as grossly inappropriate. The storming of the Bastille occurred on the 14th of July 1789, where protesters in Paris stormed the state prison, seen as a symbol of the monarchy's power, and they broke in to ransack the prison and to steal weapons and ammunition. This was seen as a huge moment in the revolution, and things continued to go downhill after this. In October 1789, an angry mob marched on Versailles and forced the royal couple to move. Louis tried to escape in June 1791, and this was seen that he was betraying the French people and consulting with foreign powers to deal with the rebels, but he was captured and was forced to accept a new constitution. In August 1792, the royal couple were arrested and were then imprisoned separately. Louis was arrested on the 13th of August and was sent to the Temple, an ancient fortress used in Paris as a prison, and within weeks the National Assembly declared France a republic and abolished the monarchy. The king was kept under arrest and was seen as a hostage, but he was also seen as dangerous, as it was predicted invading forces would try and save him. Evidence was found about his negotiations with Austria and other foreign countries, and for this the king was placed on trial. On the 11th of December 1792, he was taken from his prison to stand before the convention and to hear the charges put before him. Before the trial began, he tried to mount his defence, and he told his lawyers that he knew he would be found guilty and would be killed. He was resigned to accept his fate, and he knew what was coming, but he wanted to go down fighting. There were 3 questions that the convention were voting on. The first was, is Louis guilty? The second was, should there be an appeal to the people? And the third was, what should the punishment be for him? On the 15th of January 1793, the convention began to vote, and in total it took 36 hours to reach a decision. Louis was found overwhelmingly guilty, but there was a significant problem as to what the punishment should be. By just one vote, the sentence of death was passed for Louis, and he was condemned to death by just one single vote. A reprieve was voted down the next day, and it was voted that his execution should be conducted as swiftly as possible. His execution was scheduled for the 21st of January 1793, and his death sentence was rather controversial. To many it was seen as bringing the long-awaited end of the 1,000-year period of absolute monarchy in France, and the beginning of democracy in the nation. Others saw it as a senseless act of bloodshed, and that it showed France was heading towards a violent and immoral society. On the morning of his execution, Louis woke early. He dressed with the help of his valet, Jean-Baptiste Clary, and he then went to meet with an Irish priest, Henry Essex Edgeworth, and made his last confession. Here he heard his last mass and was given communion. The priest advised Louis to avoid saying goodbye to his family, as it would be too difficult, and at 7 o'clock he passed his final wishes on to the priest. The royal seal was to go to the Dauphin, and his wedding ring to Marie, his queen. He then went to meet the commander of the guard, and in the second court a green carriage waited for him. He climbed aboard it, with the priest and 2 guards who sat opposite them. The carriage carrying the king left Temple at 9 o'clock, and for more than an hour drummers played to drown out any support that there was for the king. They then escorted the carriage through Paris. The route was lined with 80,000 men at arms, and the cavalry who led the carriage had their sabres drawn. There was a plot to try and break the king out to save him by royalists, but this never came to anything. At 10 o'clock the carriage arrived at the Place de la Révolution, and here a scaffold had been created with a guillotine standing on it. It was surrounded by soldiers, who had guns and drums, and also a crowd who were armed with pikes and bayonets. He was approached by the executioner Sanson, who along with his assistants tied Louis's hands together. The king's hair was then cut to ensure that the execution went swiftly, and he then removed his shirt collar and was led up to the scaffold by the executioner. It was said by his priest that the path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold, silenced by his look alone. 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud they must have been heard, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Whilst on the scaffold, Louis tried to give a long speech, but a drum roll was ordered, and this led to his execution being quickened. The noise made his speech hard to understand, and with this he was then fastened quickly to the guillotine's bench. With Louis strapped to the board, he was then swiftly slid under the guillotine's yoke to hold his head in place. Once a signal was given that he was in position, the blade was released, and it quickly beheaded him. The executioner Sanson then grabbed the severed head of the king out of the basket, where it fell, and showed it to the cheering crowd. One report said that the blade did not sever his neck, and instead cut through the back of his skull and into his jaw, but as the king's head was shown, a number of the crowd rushed to the scaffold to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood. Executioner Charles Henry Sanson told of the events that day. Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked why the drums had stopped beating. He came forward to speak, but there were shouts to the executioners to get on with their work. As he was strapped down, he exclaimed, "My people, I die innocent." Then turning towards his executioners, Louis declared, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sanson then showed the head of Louis to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Vive la Nation! Vive la Republique!" arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. Another account recited to French author Victor Hugo stated, "Here are some unknown details. The executioners numbered 4. 2 only performed the execution, the 3rd stayed at the foot of the ladder, and the 4th was on the wagon, which was to convey the king's body to the Madeleine cemetery, and which was waiting a few feet from the scaffold." The executioners wore breeches, coats in the French style as the Revolution had modified it, and 3-cornered hats with enormous tricolor cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Sanson, seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people, and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. Louis XVI's body was then transported to the old church of the Madeleine, and it was buried. It was said that arriving at the cemetery I called for silence. A detachment of gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was then thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by the earth, the whole being firmly and throughoutly tampered down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. Later his remains and his queen's were reburied together inside the Basilica of Saint Denis. The execution of King Louis XVI was a pivotal moment in the history of France. It symbolised the end of the corrupt monarch that had been bleeding the country dry in the subsequent decades before, and the beginning of the revolution that led to democracy. France did suffer in the years following, with turmoil and many more executions coming, but the king's, along with his wife's, was seen as the most significant. Born on the 2nd of November 1755 in Vienna, Austria, Maria Antonia was the youngest daughter of the ruler of the Habsburg Empire, Empress Maria Theresa, and her husband Francis I, the Holy Roman Emperor. It was clear that she was destined to live a lavish lifestyle, and she spent her early years living in the royal Austrian palaces. She was well educated, however teachers commented on her lack of aptitude for learning, and she was rather poor at writing in different languages, and was also poor at speaking different languages. For princesses, mastering different languages was extremely important, as the hope was that they would marry a prince or king from a different country to forge alliances, and this did not stand Maria in good stead. She was a talented musician preferring more practical things than the academic, and it was said that her heart and character were excellent. In February 1770, Louis XV of France requested the hand of Maria for a match with his oldest surviving grandson, Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France. This was accepted to seal an alliance between the nations, and the Dauphin and Maria became engaged and then married by proxy. She met her husband on the 14th of May 1770 at Versailles, and there was a mixed reaction to the marriage. Marie initially was liked by the French people, but some did oppose the alliance with Austria. Following the death of Louis XV, the Dauphin became King Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette became the Queen of France. She initially had little influence over her husband, but received extremely lavish gifts from the king. Allegedly, one chateau she was gifted was renovated with the walls covered in diamonds and gold, and she continued to spend extremely heavily on luxuries. At the time, France was suffering greatly from financial problems, and the people of France were in great hardship, with many being even unable to buy bread for their family. Because of this, many poor people were dying, but in the face of this, Marie the Queen kept spending huge sums of money on her dresses, hairstyles, luxuries and furniture. There were riots in France, and she began to become a figure of hatred, even being blamed for the economic crisis. Everyone could see what she was doing, but Marie ignored it. Her husband Louis was also suffering. A number of blunders had lent him poorly to the French population. The couple did have children, but problems in France still remained. There was a celebration, especially with the birth of the Dauphin, but Marie also became involved in European politics. At court she promoted her favourites, and it's alleged had affairs with high-up members of society, but leaflets about the Queen's sexual deviance emerged across France. Allegations of the Queen having affairs and illicit behaviour was levelled against her, including accusations of affairs with women. With this, her mother feared for her daughter's safety, but things continued, spending large amounts of money, buying property and living the high life. More allegations emerged too regarding her lifestyle, with some levelling accusations of illegitimacy against her second-born son. With Marie willing to become involved in politics, she wanted to improve her image. The diamond necklace affair occurred, which was a scandal at court, in which part of France's most valuable jewellery was virtually stolen. Tricks emerged and it was levelled that Marie Antoinette's name was linked to the swindling of the jewellery, and this further enhanced Marie's negative reputation, despite her lack of involvement. Louis XVI often asked Marie for advice on politics, but there was a situation brewing between the Assembly and the King. But the major factor in the revolution was the financial problems in France. This was due to a number of expensive wars Louis took part in, a royal family who spent heavily, an unwillingness from the higher-up members of society to help out the lower classes. Marie became a target of disgrace, and when the revolution broke out, it had devastating consequences for the King and Queen. The revolution in France had a number of key events that saw the monarchy overthrown. The storming of the Bastille was a sign of the King's decreasing power, and how the people could rise up and overthrow the monarchy, and the anger they had towards Louis and Marie, and the desperation spurred on the revolt. The revolution even forced the royal family to move out of their palace, and European powers sought to try and find a way for the French royal family to escape the anarchy. Several plots were drawn up, but the Queen rejected them, as she refused to leave without Louis, her husband. The royal family found themselves imprisoned, and on the 21st of September 1792, the National Assembly declared France a republic. Previously, an angry mob had broken into the French royal palace and insulted Marie and threatened to kill her, and there was bloodshed inside of the palace. With the declaration of the Republic, Louis was placed on trial and was sentenced to death on the 15th of January 1793. He was then 6 days later executed by guillotine in front of a huge crowd in Paris. The Queen, now a widow, was in great mourning. She hoped that one day her son would become king, however was a prisoner to the French people. Whilst imprisoned at the Tower of the Temple, she along with her children were insulted and kept under strict watch to ensure she could not communicate with the outside. Marie's fate after Louis's execution became a big question, with debate occurring as what to do with her. Others wished to have her executed, but some wanted her exchanging in a swap for French prisoners of war, or even sending to America. Decisions were made to retrain her son, the 8-year-old Dauphin, in the ways of the revolution, and Marie was transferred from the Temple to a small cell in the conciergerie. She was kept under constant watch and was given no privacy during this time. She was brought to trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal on the 14th of October 1793, and it's thought that the outcome had already been decided that she would be put to death. She faced a number of different charges, financial ones regarding her relationships, and even planning massacres. She was even accused of incest, but little could be done, and she was found guilty of 3 main charges: of the depletion of the national treasury, of conspiracy against the security of the state, and of high treason, and for this she was sentenced to death. She believed the worst she would get would be imprisonment, so the death sentence came at a shock. In her final days she wrote to her sister-in-law, expressing her love for her children, and her devotion to Catholicism, and her will was made. In preparation for her execution, she was forced to change her clothes in front of the guards. She was forced to wear a plain white dress, although wished to wear a black one. Her hair was cut short against her wishes, to ensure that the guillotine took her life without any issue. As she was taken out of her cell, she was bound with her hands tied behind her back, painfully hurting the former Queen of France. Marie was then placed on a rope lead and taken to her carriage. She was taken to her execution on an open cart, with it taking an hour to arrive at the Place de la Révolution. The crowds would have lined the streets as the slow cart moved throughout the city of Paris, and when she arrived at her execution site, the guillotine stood ready for her. At around 12:15 p.m. on the 16th of October 1793, Marie Antoinette stepped onto the scaffold to greet Charles Henry Sanson, a notorious executioner who took her husband's head 10 months before. He was stood in a black mask and probably never dreamed of the fact he would execute the Queen of France. As she approached the executioner, she stood accidentally on Sanson's foot and said, "Pardon me, sir, I didn't mean to." Whilst on the scaffold, it was said she maintained her composure, but the crowd hurled insults and jeers at her. A priest accompanied her, and everything was ready for the Queen's execution. Minutes after she made her way onto the scaffold, she was placed onto the guillotine. Marie Antoinette's execution was remarkably swift, as was common with the guillotine, and her head was taken clean off by the blade. She would have been placed onto the board, then slid under the blade before it fell, and within seconds her head was taken clean off. Her head was then held up to the crowd, and Sanson proclaimed to the roaring crowd, "Vive la République!" Marie Antoinette's remains were then taken to a graveyard behind the Church de Medellin, around half a mile away. The gravediggers were on a lunch break, which allowed Madame Tussaud to take a wax imprint of her face before she was then placed in an unmarked grave. Decades later her body was exhumed and she was given a proper burial, and it was said that some of her white hair remained on her skeleton. Marie Antoinette was a very divisive figure in France, and the vast majority of the French population greatly disliked her for her lavish spending, all whilst the French were struggling to buy loaves of bread. She was a figure of the monarchy in France and became a controversial figure of the French Revolution. Some see her as a scapegoat, but what cannot be excused is the expense she spent on nonsense during her time as queen, gambling away thousands whilst everyone was suffering. Without Marie, there most probably would not have been a revolution in France.
Georges Danton was the son of an attorney, and he was born on the 26th of October 1759. He attended a school in Champagne, and then from 1773 he was educated by the Oratorians at Troyes. He then studied for a law degree, and he went to the French capital of Paris to practice, and he then married Antoinette Charpentier. The couple lived in a spacious apartment and had 3 sons. The first would tragically die in infancy, being around 11 months old, when he passed away. Following the outbreak of the French Revolution, the promising lawyer then enrolled in the Civic Guard of the Cordeliers district, and he was then months later elected the president of the area. In spring 1790 he founded the popular group which was known as the Cordeliers Club. But he was at the time just a local celebrity, but it would not be long before he became a national figure. Danton was elected a member of the Provisional Paris Commune, or the City Council, in January 1790, but was excluded for a number of months. He had no influence really at the time, but the Cordeliers Club was a group that championed universal male suffrage, and it was on the lookout for men who were abusing power. It would be involved in the arrest of the leadership, and was later involved in challenging Robespierre. Danton was a key figure in the club, and he was also part of the Jacobin Club, and he made speeches in front of their members. But as Louis XVI tried to flee France in June 1791, Georges Danton became a leading figure in the revolution. He did not sign the petition demanding that Louis abdicated, and during the repression of some revolutionaries by the National Guard, he hid in London. But it wouldn't be long before Danton returned to Paris, and he was then in December 1791 elected the second assistant to the public prosecutor of Paris. In spring 1792 he resumed his role representing the revolution, and he began to attack other people in power, including the Marquis de Lafayette, who was an advisor to the king. He remained in the background as people demonstrated at the royal palace, and it's believed at this time he did not have too much involvement in the overthrow of the monarchy. However, he spoke before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and he claimed he had been responsible for many events, but it was more the collective efforts of the people than Danton's work. He did play a small part in removing the king, and he was elected the Ministry of Justice. He dominated other lawyers in this group, and was able with his revolutionary ideas to make quick decisions. Danton did encounter some problems with other revolutionaries, as he would object to moving the government from Paris to Blois, but then Verdun was besieged, and the people raided prisons looking for traitors. Danton then spoke in the Legislative Assembly saying, "To conquer the enemies of the fatherland, we need daring, more daring, daring now and always, and France is saved." At the time Danton was speaking, the prison massacres began, and he was charged with the responsibility of these. It's not known whether the massacres were organised by him, but Georges Danton did not stop the massacres of people suspected of being traitors. He was then elected deputy for Paris to the National Convention, and he made every effort to end the disputes between different revolutionary parties. He took no part in the start of King Louis XVI's trial, as he was sent to Belgium on a mission, but he was present and voted for the king's death and execution. But it was later claimed he wanted to spare the king. He had plotted to see if the English government would intervene, but after the failing of this he then voted for the death of the king. Danton then remained a figure of the revolution, and he then became a member of the First Committee of Public Safety. For around 3 months he was serving as the head of the government, and he dealt with foreign affairs and army matters. But his political work was not always clear, and he reappeared from time to time, claiming to be the voice of the masses. But he became a leader of the Indulgence, a moderate faction. He did not intervene to criticise the new government policies, but he did disapprove of the reign of terror and the repression across France. He then allegedly withdrew from political life because of his health, or for his family as he was worried for them, but he later returned within weeks, and he resumed his political work. He was determined to save his friends who were arrested or were in danger of being arrested, but his moderate line remained, and some of his friends along with him as time went on began to become more critical of the system of terror used by Robespierre and the policies of the revolutionary government. Because of this, Georges Danton began to attract suspicion, and other groups sought to dig their claws in. The government did not want moderates to overwhelm it, and Danton knew that one day he would be brought to trial. In the evening of the 30th of March 1794, he was arrested. On the 2nd of April his trial began, and he was charged with conspiracy and also theft, corruption and a financial scandal. Those who followed Danton were considered false patriots by Robespierre, and Danton was on his own. At trial he made a severe amount of commotion, and he was sent to the guillotine. The jury had only 7 members, and during the trial he made violent attacks on Robespierre, and the court's president struggled to control the proceedings. The defendants, however, were then taken from the courtroom before the guilty verdict came, and the death sentence was passed. They then had their heads shaved and cut, ready to prepare for the guillotine. Georges Danton was executed on the 5th of April 1794. He was one of 15 people to be beheaded in the same group as him, and this included many others being found guilty of being an enemy of the revolution. His execution took place in Paris, and it was said Danton was the first to climb into the first of 3 carts which were to take the group to the Place de la Révolution. He had to wait until all 3 carts were loaded so they could go to the execution together. The loading took over an hour because Camille Desmoulins struggled a long time with the executioner and knocked him down twice. He refused to have his hands tied or his hair cut, and they say the gendarmes had to help the executioner overcome Camille's resistance. During this time, Danton was laughing in the cart and nodding to the other condemned men, who were now bound and placed in their carts, to show that he was being kept waiting too long. He chatted to Lacroix and Heralt, who were next to him, saying within the hearing of the people, besides the carriages near to the palace courtyard rails, "What annoys me the most is that I am going to die 6 weeks before Robespierre." Eventually Camille appeared in the cart. His shirt was in ribbons, he was out of breath, frenzied, loudly cursing Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, and the infamous tribunal which served these monsters. The condemned went to their deaths in the midst of the huge crowd of Republicans, who were there to watch the original founders of their republic lose their heads. Seeing the procession pass, a woman in the Rue Saint Honore looked at Danton and exclaimed, "How ugly he is!" He smiled at her and said, "There's no point in telling me that now, I shan't be ugly much longer." His face did in fact look like the head of a lion, while Robespierre is like that of a cat or a tiger. When they reached the place of execution, they were made to get out of the carts at the foot of the scaffold. They climbed up one by one to be executed, and watched as the others died under the blade. Danton was the last. When he saw the executioner coming for him at the foot of the scaffold, he cried out in a strong voice, "My turn now," and quickly climbed the fatal ladder. As they were tying him to the block, he looked calmly at the blade, dripping with his friend's blood, and bent his head saying, "It's only a sabre cut." Danton is dead, Robespierre triumphant. The tiger has beaten the lion, but the triumph will not last. If we can believe Danton's prediction on his way to the scaffold, and he was a man who understood revolutions. Georges Danton was a leading figure in the French Revolution, but like many of those who went against the terror and the severe ideas of Robespierre, he made his way to the guillotine and lost his head. Maximilian Robespierre was born at Arras on the 6th of May 1758. He studied law and then in 1789 was elected to become a representative of the commoners of Arras in the Estates General. But at the time France was beginning to get very tired of its king and queen. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had attracted a huge amount of criticism, and the way they ruled in France was seen as disgraceful, especially by the commoners who were suffering heavily. Many could not afford food and were starving, but the royalty were having huge and lavish banquets and spending obscene amounts of money and wealth on clothing, jewellery and other items. The Third Estate, which represented the commoners and the lesser clergy, declared itself the National Assembly, and with this Robespierre then became a leading figure in the ideas of the revolution. He became a democratic and radical figure, and he loathed the king and queen. He presided over the Jacobins, who were a powerful political group who promoted the ideas of the French Revolution and the overthrow of the monarchy. He also encouraged people to rise up about military defeats and the lack of food. Robespierre was a figure who spoke for the king to be put on trial for treason, and he campaigned for the king to be executed and to fall. He had a number of significant enemies, but in Paris he was very popular. He continued to attack the monarchy and call for reform, and he was in August 1792 elected as the first deputy for Paris to the National Convention. The convention then abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic, and the king was then placed on trial for treason, which Robespierre wanted and supported, and the king was executed in January 1793. Following the king's death, there was a struggle for power within the convention, and there was a significant amount of tension between the Jacobins and the significantly more moderate Girondins. The Jacobins used the power of the mobs and the angry people to take control, and the Girondins were arrested. The control of the country passed to the Committee of Public Safety, and Robespierre was a member of this, and over time he quickly became the most powerful and dominating member of the committee. But in France at the time, there was a significant threat to the country from the form of a foreign invasion from countries who were angry that the king and queen had been executed. There was also a significant amount of lawlessness and disorder all over the land, and with this the committee then began to eliminate anyone who they believed was an enemy of the revolution. This was known as the Terror, or the Reign of Terror, and Robespierre was a powerful figure who was in charge of part of this. In a speech he would state why it was necessary, and he said, "If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without terror is baneful, terror without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the homeland." This was a dark and violent period during the revolution, as radicals seized control of the government and executed anyone who they believed may have been disloyal to the ideas of the revolution. France was ruled by terror, and people had to be incredibly careful about what they said and what they did. The slightest sniff of resistance or opposition could result in someone being thrown in prison or sent to their death on the guillotine. All someone had to do was to accuse someone, and they were usually then considered guilty, and many were executed unfairly. There were people executed who even cut down a tree or a liberty tree, which was adopted as a symbol of the revolution. There were also many other people executed for just saying the slightest negative thing about the revolution. There were stories also of women who were weeping as their husbands were executed on the guillotine, and their tears were then seen as a symbol of defiance, before they were too dragged onto the execution device and were killed. Heads were rolling constantly, and many people were being beaten in the streets. There was bloodshed all over France, but no one could have predicted Robespierre's downfall. As his power increased, his popularity decreased. He recommended that the National Convention proclaim a new official religion for France, the cult of the Supreme Being, but the intensity of the Reign of Terror and Robespierre's power made him a symbol of unpopularity, and many believed he was ruling tyrannically, almost like the monarch was, and in France they had previously executed one. There were French military successes, and these at the time undermined the justification for the brutality of the Reign of Terror, championed by Robespierre. On the 27th of July 1794, Robespierre and his allies were arrested by the National Assembly after a group of rebels got together to conspire against him. There was a struggle, and during this Robespierre was wounded after a bullet hit him in the jaw. but the next day he would be killed. One eyewitness said of the execution of Robespierre, "At 4 in the afternoon, the sinister procession moved out of the courtyard of the Palais de Justice. No crowd of such a size had ever been seen in Paris. The streets were choked with people. Spectators, men and women of all ages, filled every window, and men had climbed onto the rooftops. There was universal jubilation coupled with popular fury. The long-suppressed hatred against these criminals now exploded with double force. Everyone applauded wildly and seemed to be sorry they could do no more. Most of the watchers fixed their gaze on the cart in which Robespierre, his brother, and 2 other men were riding. These miserable creatures were all mutilated and covered with blood. They looked like a band of brigands the gendarmes had surprised in the forest and were unable to arrest without inflicting serious wounds upon them. It would be difficult to describe the appearance of Robespierre. His face was wrapped in a bandage of dirty blood-stained linen. His features were horribly disfigured. A pale pallor made it even more repulsive. He kept his eyes downward and almost closed. Whether that was from the pain of his wounds or an awareness of his misdeeds, one cannot say. Just before arriving at the place of execution, Robespierre was shaken out of his lethargy by a woman who forced her way through the crowd and rushed up to the cart carrying this cannibal. She grasped the cart rail with one hand and threatened Robespierre with the other, saying, "Monster spewed from hell, the thought of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." Robespierre opened his eyes and looked at her sadly, and she said, "Go now, evildoer, go down in your grave carrying the curses of the wives and the mothers of France." When the cart had reached the foot of the scaffold, the executioners carried the tyrant down and laid him prone until it was turned for his execution. Whilst his accomplices were being beheaded, Robespierre appeared not to be taking notice. He kept his eyes shut and did not open them until he himself was carried up to the scaffold. Some said that when he saw the instrument of death he heaved a sigh of pain, but before dying he had to endure bitter suffering. After having thrown down his coat, the executioner roughly tore away the bandage and splint which the surgeon had put on his wounds. This unhinged his lower jaw from the upper jaw and caused the blood to flow in torrents. The wretched man's head was now no more than an object of horror and repulsion. When at last it was severed from his body and the executioner held it by the hair to show the people, it presented an indescribably horrible sight. Thus perished the fiercest of the savage beasts, the most monstrous criminal that nature ever conceived. On the 2 days that followed, 83 other rebels were put to death, mainly members of the committee or their outlawed accomplices. Robespierre was an influential and important figure in France, who as quickly as he rose to prominence, he fell from grace. He was executed on the very device which took the lives of the king and queen, and he was proclaimed too an enemy of the revolution that he was so influential in. Today he is considered the man who oversaw a brutal period of time in France, which was marked by mass execution of innocent people and great lawlessness and brutality. But on the guillotine in Paris, he too would meet a brutal and bloody fate. Inside of France in the summer of 1793, there was a feeling amongst the politicians in the country that there would be a civil war, and that there could be a counter-revolution in which people wanted to reinstate the monarchy. Bertrand Barrère, a member of the National Convention, stated, "Let's make terror the order of the day," and with this it's believed that he wanted to impose a system of terror inside the country to stave off the threat of a return to the old system of government and monarchy. The convention agreed to create the Revolutionary Army, but other historians have claimed that there was not actually a system of terror officially instated by the new government. However, Robespierre would refer to the idea of terror, and he hoped that fear would keep the enemies of the Republic at bay. Robespierre did not agree with having terror as the order of the day initially, and as a policy of the government, but he would instead refer to this as justice, seeing the executions of people in opposition as necessary. He would say in a speech, "If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without terror is baneful. Terror without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the homeland." The monarchies of Europe were hostile to the French Revolution,
and they believed that the ideas would spread to other countries, leading to those monarchies being overthrown as well. The Austrian king and Prussian king would say that they would invade France if the French king was threatened, and these statements created a fear of invasion in the country, and that outside countries would be messing with French affairs. This made revolutionaries more hostile to the king, who was of course executed, but others would declare war against Austria and Prussia. France would suffer heavy defeats, but they did stop the Austrian and Prussian forces from invading the country. But their defeats created a lot of paranoia, and it is with this that served as justification for the violence of the Reign of Terror, and the government justified it, saying it was necessary to unify France in the face of foreign opponents. On the 10th of March 1793, the National Convention created the Revolutionary Tribunal. This was a body that would deal with many of the accused of treason against the revolution. Around half of those who were charged by the tribunal were acquitted, but the terror was in a sense a purge of the people, and a purge of those who may have harboured slight sympathy for the monarchy. One of the figures who would spearhead this was Maximilian Robespierre, who became the brutal leader of the Committee of Public Safety. The committee would persecute many different people who would not completely agree with them, and they would purge those with different beliefs, leading to high-profile politicians, such as Georges Danton, being sent to the guillotine. There was unrest and violence in many French regions, and people believed that the terror went against the foundations of the revolution. Robespierre wanted the revolution to have one single will, and at the end of March 1794, Georges Danton, who criticised the Committee of Public Safety, was arrested on charges of corruption and conspiracy. Robespierre insisted on his execution, and along with 14 others, he lost his head on the guillotine. The guillotine as a device was only really developed in France as an execution device and method, so that the heads of the critics could be taken off quickly in public. The idea of a public execution was key, so that the terror could be witnessed by people all around. The most common form of execution during the Reign of Terror was beheading, and in Paris this was done at the Place de la Révolution. The victims in groups of dozens would be gathered together and would be taken to the guillotine in carts, often after hastily arranged trials, and from here they would be marched up to the steps of the scaffold. The executioners and their assistants would not even have time to clean the blade. With this, one by one, the victims would be then strapped to the wooden board before they were placed under the slanted blade of the guillotine, and the executioner would then release the blade, taking their heads clean off. The terror lasted from September 1793 to July 1794, and in this the guillotine developed a reputation for being the national razor, and each day many people were being executed. What was shocking also is the weight of accusation that was levelled against the people who would be taken to the execution device. Often the condemned would have been suspected of harbouring anti-revolutionary ideas, and people would get revenge on their enemies by accusing them to the Committee of Public Safety. This meant that men and women who would just mention the slightest criticism would be marched to the guillotine. There are some harrowing stories, including one in which the wife of a condemned man, who was watching the proceedings beneath the guillotine, saw her husband's head being taken off. As she saw this, she began to cry, and this was interpreted as an act of sympathy for the anti-revolutionists, and because of this the woman was then taken to the guillotine seconds later, being executed seconds after her husband was for crying. People could be condemned for a huge variety of reasons, from cutting down or damaging a tree of liberty, to simply just saying the slightest remark which could have been taken the wrong way. Criminals were also executed during this time, and some accounts state that 16,000 people were killed on the guillotine during the terror. Possibly the most famous victim of the terror in many ways was Marie Antoinette, the Queen. She was dragged out to the Place de la Révolution in Paris on the 16th of October 1793, and for months the government had deliberated on what to do with her, following the execution of her husband the king. Many feared that executing Marie would spring war with Austria even more, as she was an Austrian princess, but they went ahead anyway and beheaded her. The establishment of a special court by the Committee of Public Safety would lead to thousands of death sentences, and the bodies and heads of the victims were often displayed in public and above city walls to serve as a warning to the people to fall into line. They also used cannons to execute when the guillotines were busy. Amongst the dead during the terror were many of the brightest political figures and hopes across the land, but many of the other victims remain faceless, and they are not known to history. Many were members of the church or the defenders of the old regime and monarchy, but also many of the members were peasants who were starving and were struggling. Once the terror began, it was impossible to stop, and Robespierre would pass the law of 22 par aile, which took the rights away for those accused to have a public trial and for legal assistance. Juries could only acquit or sentence to death. There was no possibility of jail time, and this only created more death. In the Vendée, a region of western France, the terror was strong and brutal. This was a stronghold of royalist support and belief, and they rose up in rebellion against the revolutionary government. Because of this, the government sent soldiers to deal with the uprisings, and these troops were ruthless and would slaughter vast swathes of the civilian population. At Savonneres, the soldiers massacred, and in Chalais, they killed over 2,000 people, including women and children. The terror would continue much longer in this area, until the uprising was finally dealt with. In Nantes, there was a system of mass drownings used, where victims were tied up and thrown into the Loire River, and it's believed 3,000 people were killed in this way. Inside of Paris, the executions and guillotines were so frequent that the flagstones and the streets began to become clogged with the blood of the victims, so that the whole square, the Place de la Révolution, began to stink. Executions because of this were then moved to the site of the former Bastille, but as time went on, the crowds at the executions began to dwindle and shrink. Robespierre, the leader of the terror, was himself executed during it, as he would be taken to the Place de la Révolution along with 21 other convicts. It would be Charles Henry Sanson, the man who executed the king and queen, who would also take Robespierre's life, and it was said that when he was beheaded, there were joyous cries and applause that broke out within the crowd, which lasted for some time. But the effects of the terror sometimes did more damage than they intended, and because of the executions, there was a significant amount of paranoia and unease across the nation. People began to become disillusioned with the revolution, and people even called for a restoration of the monarchy. But it was a brutal and bloody time in France, when thousands of people were executed in huge public scenes of horror, and when the streets would run red with the blood of the unfortunate.
Elizabeth was born on the 3rd of May 1764 and was the youngest child of Louis, the Dauphin of France. Her grandparents were King Louis XV and Queen Marie, but following the sudden death of her father in 1765, Elizabeth's older brother Louis became the Dauphin and the heir apparent. Their mother died in 1767, leaving Elizabeth an orphan at the age of 2, along with her siblings. She was raised by her governess alongside her sister, Clothilde, and the pair were very different. Elizabeth was considered a proud and passionate child, and she was given a brilliant education befitting her status as a royal princess. She was schooled in history, geography, and other interesting skills, such as botany and religion. In her free time she went for walks in the park, but at some point Elizabeth wished to focus on other things rather than school, and she got to a point where she was not too bothered by her education. But in 1770, her older brother married Marie Antoinette of Austria, and Marie described Elizabeth as delightful and favoured her over her sister. But on the 10th of May 1774, her grandfather died, and her elder brother then became the king. But her sister then left for France the following year, and the sisters tearfully parted. It was said by Marie Antoinette that, "My sister Elizabeth is a charming child, who has much intelligence, character, and grace." She showed the greatest feeling, and much above her age, at the departure of her sister. The poor little girl was in despair, and as her health is very delicate, she was taken ill and had a very severe nervous attack. I own to my dear mamma that I feel I am getting too attached to her, feeling, from the example of my aunts, how essential it is for her happiness not to remain an old maid in this country. Elizabeth left the children's chamber and became an adult in 1778, and then she was given her own household. There were many attempts to make marriage arrangements for Elizabeth, and she was seen by her brother as someone who could help secure alliances for France. One suggestion was a Prince of Brazil, but then the Duke of Aosta, the future King of Sardinia. But a marriage was then proposed between her and her sister's brother-in-law, Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor. He said he was attracted to her, but at court there was some opposition to this, and then no further arrangements were made, despite her only being a very young girl at the time. Elizabeth said, "I can only marry a king's son, and a king's son must reign over his father's kingdom. I should no longer be a Frenchwoman. I do not wish to cease to be one. It is far better to stay here, at the foot of my brother's throne, than to ascend to another. Elizabeth was not seen as an important royal during the French Revolution, and she saw the court as lavish and extravagant, and she actually distanced herself from it. She only attended when it was necessary, and she was certainly smarter than the king and queen. Elizabeth had great respect for her brother, and she did stand by him, but her relationship with Marie Antoinette was mixed. The pair were very different, and Marie found Elizabeth delightful, but Elizabeth was close to her aunts, who were against Marie at court, and they treated her with animosity. Elizabeth would then criticise Marie and her extravagant behaviour, especially as the French people were suffering. She was given land and other houses by the king, and she was given a new house, a place where the king did not allow her to spend nights until she was 24. But whilst here she enjoyed gardening and taking part in many different activities. She even distributed charity to the local villagers, and she did help when she could, having her farm tended to with the locals getting the food and the goods. But as the French Revolution began, Elizabeth refused to leave and emigrate, even after the storming of the Bastille, and she saw the Women's March on Versailles and immediately returned to the palace. She advised her brother the king to repress the riot quickly, but the advice was not accepted. The mob stormed the palace and tried to assassinate the queen, but Elizabeth then went with the royal family to Paris. She lived with them and was housed beside the queen on the first floor. But one evening women climbed into her apartment, but Princess Elizabeth did have a good reputation with the public. She was seen different to Marie. She was seen differently to Marie Antoinette, and she would spend her evenings working on tapestries, but she had a better reputation than the Queen. She chose yet again to remain in France, but she did try to escape in June 1791, but the escape plan did fail, and the royal family were then placed under surveillance. But no one was told to guard over Elizabeth, and she was free to leave whenever she wanted, but she chose not to. Elizabeth was seen as different from the king and queen to begin with, but she knew that something bad would happen to the royal family. The royal court believed there would be an attack on the palace, and she witnessed her brother's dethronement. She was described as calm when this happened, but following the execution of the king, Elizabeth was left with Marie Antoinette in their apartment. When she was moved, Elizabeth asked to stay in contact, but Marie was executed on the 16th of October, 1793. Her last letter she wrote was addressed to Elizabeth, but she never received it. Accusations during her trial were levelled against Elizabeth, but after the overthrow she was not considered dangerous by Robespierre. They intended to banish her from France, but she was accused of having taken part in secret meetings with Marie and then conspiring against the French people. She was said to have sold her diamonds to help fund a war, and also to having arranged a massacre of people during the storming of the palace. Elizabeth knew this was wrong, and she was then taken under arrest and was escorted and held in a single cell. She was refused a public defender and was tried along with 24 other accomplices, including 10 women. During her trial she was accused of being an enemy of the revolution, and following this she was sentenced to death as a sister of the tyrant king. Her death sentence was a little bit unfair, and she was executed on the guillotine. Following her trial, Elizabeth joined the other condemned prisoners inside the Hall of the Condemned, awaiting their execution. She rallied and comforted other condemned people before the executions, and it was said she spoke to them with inexpressible gentleness and calm, dominating their mental suffering by the serenity of her look, the tranquillity of her appearance, and the influence of her words. Elizabeth was to be executed along with 23 men and women who had been tried and condemned at the same time as her. As she approached the guillotine, the white cloth which covered her head was blown off, and she was the only person with a bare head in the procession of the dead. As she reached the foot of the guillotine, there was a bench for the condemned to wait before their execution. Elizabeth left the cart first and made her own way down, but she was then the last to be executed. One woman bowed for her as she went on the gallows. She helped the others through their ordeal, and the last person before her gave her his bow, and she said courage and faith in the mercy of God before it was her turn. As she was summoned to the guillotine, she was strapped quickly on the board, and her shawl fell off and exposed her shoulders, and she said to the executioner, "In the name of your mother, cover me." But as the blade fell on her neck, the execution struck a chord with many of the bystanders. They did not issue a rallying cry in favour of the revolution, and they were respectful. Robespierre himself was concerned about the effect of her death, and it only made people question the reign of terror. Her remains were then buried in a common grave, and they were later disinterred with other victims of the guillotine, and were placed inside the catacombs of Paris. Princess Elizabeth was practically executed for the sole reason, for the fact she was a sister of the king. Many people believe she was a supporter of the royalists, but she was critical of the king and queen throughout her life. She was a dedicated and devoted woman who gave herself to charitable causes and her faith, and she saw the French Revolution as an evil on earth. But it was at the guillotine where she was brutally executed. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.